Yeah, scoping honestly is one of the parts where I think we actually do spend the most amount of time, right? Because we want to make sure that this is tailored to what the client needs and it's tailored to their environment. So, what part of what we do at Mandiant, and I think we do particularly well, is making sure that we're being detailed and we're tailoring this so it's curated to the organization. So, we spend a lot of time saying, okay, well, what's most business critical? Is that an application that's cloud facing that maybe those response, because you've got third parties involved, that response effort might be a lot different.
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I am your host, Luke McNamara. Today, it is great to be joined by Alishia Hoy, Senior Consultant with Mandiant Consulting. Alishia, great to have you here today.
Perfect. Thanks for having me, Luke.
So the topic that we are going to dive in today is tabletop exercises. I hadn't planned this, and I think we'd already started talking about doing this as a episode, this particular theme, and just coming back recently from MWise, I actually heard the topic of tabletop exercises mentioned in several of the keynotes. So maybe good timing with this, given that it's folding into other conversations, larger conversations that are happening across the security industry. So before we jump into the topic of tabletop exercises, I know because there's a lot of different functions and roles across the consulting team. What specifically do you do within consulting these days?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm part of the strategic consulting team out here in Canada. We do a lot of transformation, advisory services, as well as assessments. And so a good part of that is really understanding what's going on in the industry, what are threat actors currently doing, what are we currently seeing from leading edge organizations and security practices, right? So that all feeds into tabletop exercises because as part of that, we need to know what's going on in the industry, what's going on with threat actors, what's currently going on, and what are we seeing more specifically at the technical level within incidents. And so we get to pull all that information within tabletop exercises, as well as all the different engagements that we do. And so it makes for an interesting time when we're developing and tailoring these for an organization's environment.
And we're going to dive into what the various components that go into a tabletop exercise, how those actually kind of play out. But maybe at a high level, if you could give us an understanding, because tabletop exercises, or at least that concept, is certainly not specific or new to just cyber. It's used, I think, in a lot of other disciplines. But if you could explain maybe within the cyber concept, how is it typically employed? Who is typically involved when we're doing a tabletop exercise for a customer?
Yeah, so a tabletop exercise is a simulated exercise, right, that follows a series of activities that you would see in an incident. So we deliver information over the period of time, 3 to 4 hours, that emulate all the different activities you would see, starting at detection, investigation, all the way leading to recovery. We want to define those and design those so that people can figure out the different steps they would take at each stage of the incident. We can design these for executives, right, to go through the different levels of decision authorities, some of the elements of roles and responsibilities, oversight. And we can also design these for the technical level so they can understand whether the key steps, the more granular activities that they would take at each stage, once they discover something could be happening, once they confirm that something is happening, and then as they move into the steps to get the attacker out of the environment and figure out what is good, how is this good, to move actually into recovery.
And do those, you mentioned 3 to 4 hours typically, do those vary based on the audience? Do you do blended audience where you have, the technical team, then also executives, maybe some of the other business functions? How does that kind of change when you're doing an engagement?
Yeah, so obviously with executive time, we'll start there. Those are harder to get, right? Because we want to be cognizant of their time. So usually that's around 2.5 hours to 3 hours to really focus on the key points. For example, if we're going through ransomware, we'll often look at engage, not engage, pay, not pay. What are some of the different notifications and regulatory considerations? What are some of the communications? So we'll design that to really focus on those key elements, but make sure that we're being cognizant of the time that they have and respect that. From a technical perspective, usually it's about 4 hours, so we can actually go through what are some of the key activities you would take when you're doing your initial investigation. What are some of the key things that you would look for when you're doing containment? How do you determine what you're going to contain and who has to approve if you need to contain something that's public facing, for instance? And so we can get a little bit more into those nitty gritties. And so that's usually about 4 hours. And so if we say, you know what, we want a hybrid exercise, which is I think what you were alluded to, we want to bring some executives, we want to bring some technical teams in, or at least management level of the technical teams. that's typically going to be around 3 hours, right? Because again, we want to be cognizant of the executive time, but we still need enough time to talk through some of the different consideration and interaction points between the executive and technical teams.
Let's talk a little bit about the scoping or pre-work. So, when a lot of situations where you're having a customer bring you in to do this, is there a specific piece of their response process, maybe even specific teams that they know that they want to test? Are there certain scenarios saying, look, I know obviously ransomware is a big deal. I want to kind of test my playbooks and processes around that sort of threat. Do you kind of work with them to figure out, okay, maybe these are the sorts of people you want to have in the room? Maybe there's this particular function that you're trying to grow your maturity in. So we're going to emphasize this more in the exercise. What sort of goes on in this sort of like scoping kind of pre-work process?
Yeah, scoping honestly is one of the parts where I think we actually do spend the most amount of time, right? Because we want to make sure that this is tailored to what the client needs and it's tailored to their environment. So, what part of what we do at Mandiant, and I think we do particularly well, is making sure that we're being detailed and we're tailoring this so it's curated to the organization. So, we spend a lot of time saying, okay, well, what's most business critical? Is that an application that's cloud facing that maybe those response, because you've got third parties involved, that response effort might be a lot different? Or for example, you've got a new C-suite team and they haven't exercised this, they haven't really held and worked out that their roles in the incident response plan. Okay, well, let's look at that to figure out where do they come in. Or perhaps you've got a new incident commander, you've got a new CISO, they want to see how things work. Okay, so let's design a more complicated technical exercise so that the CISO can see how their team comes into action, especially when related to activities that they may not see on a day to day, right? Like something like a wide scale containment or something that requires full scale recovery in a different environment. But we really look at what's your objective, and we'll talk and have that conversation with the customer to say, what do you really need out of this? What are you looking for? And what are some of those pain points that you're really worried about, or that you might be worried about, but you're not sure that you want to dive deep in the simulated exercise?
So let's transition that, I guess, that piece into the actual elements, the scenarios. So walk us through now that you're kind of like building that out. What are the various components of the tabletop exercise? Either as you're putting that together or they're actually starting to kind of walk through that. You've kicked the tabletop exercise off, people are participating. How does that take place?
Yeah, so let's maybe start with something like ransomware exercise, right? So if we say we want to design this for an executive exercise, typically we'll design it to say, how did you actually get, how were you actually made aware of the ransomware? What would be your initial steps? Who would be notified of that? Is that a broader team? Is that a smaller team? Following that, how do you manage communications? How are you managing external communications? How are you managing internal communications? And in parallel, how are you actually making some of those decisions on, do you actually engage or not engage? What are the key factors for the organization if you might want to actually engage the threat actor? Would you do that? How would you do that? And so when you're designing the exercise, I think the most important thing is to understand how would you actually find out the different pieces. So how would the information actually present itself as the incident unfolds? There's two views of an incident, right? The actual like life cycle where you say all the way from detection all the way to complete mission, right? If you look at the Mandiant framework to say how does this actually work, but then how that information actually gets applied in an actual incident or in a tabletop, how you discover the different things that have happened in your environment, they may not follow that linear pattern, right? You may not, you are very unlikely to discover the attack vector right away. So we like to look at it as what's the complete storyline, and then how do we break that all up in a way that you would actually see it in the incident, and then build it out from there. How do you figure out all the different things that are going to happen? Or how would you figure out all the different things that would happen and then tell you that story in that way that helps to achieve all the different objectives that you're looking for?
So actually on that piece around how would you actually, detect something or what would kick off of an incident investigation? Um, do you structure it around the aspect of from like the communications piece? So is it something where you're like, rather than if your organization typically doesn't have everyone physically co-located in the same place, people are going to be spread out. People are going to be dialing in if an incident were to happen. Do you advise teams and organizations don't bring everyone in person to the same room? Actually treat this as if this was a real thing and people are getting onto Teams or Google Meet call. Do you get down to that level of trying to like structure the actual way the incident plays out in kind of a similar dynamic?
We have actually done that. I would say I wouldn't recommend that for your first tabletop. It can get messy, right? You can discover certain things. Like one time we've had clients where they were using two different pieces of the IRP that were separate and they weren't up to date. So then trying to get everyone together to talk the same language, when would you call in, how would you call in, who would call in, it gets messy, right? Because you end up with things where people don't realize when or not they should be brought in. So yes, sometimes that can be interesting because you can see practically where are some of those gaps that we didn't know we had, or do people know where the which bridge they're supposed to join, or is that supposed to come from somebody, or what if somebody doesn't see it? So absolutely, like practically, those are good things to test, especially if your organization is more mature and you've done a few exercises. Then let's see practically how would this actually happen, and what's your backup if you call somebody and they're not available? Then who's actually stepping in? How do you get a hold of them?
That's a good point. Um, on the piece around the kind of the prompt. So again, we're in the middle of an actual exercise. You have kind of the scenario that you've worked with the customer to tailor kind of to their needs. It's almost kind of like a choose your own adventure story. It sounds like the way you're kind of framing it. So are you feeding them prompts as they're coming up with, okay, well now we choose to investigate this system and remediate this, pull this offline. Are you then kind of, quickly following up with prompts of, all right, what do you do now? Here's some new information that's presented to you. How does that kind of play out?
Yeah, so part of the actual design is coming up with facilitation questions. And you asked at the very beginning of how do you make sure we get those objectives? So, as part of the objectives, we'll create questions that back up those objectives to make sure that if you say communications are very important, or if you say we're really worried with decision authorities. We make sure that we ask them specific questions at different points so that we can get some of those answers. So at the end, you say, yeah, we walked through this incident. It was great because maybe half our team or half the participants don't typically see this on a day to day, but we also got at least some sort of direction to the questions we had. What we try to do as part of the questions is there's a really fine balance of asking questions to direct the conversation, but also not asking leading questions because we want to make sure that we're not almost pigeonholing someone into saying, but would you do this? And they say, well, I guess the way you asked it, of course you're going to do this. We want to make sure that we, as facilitators, leave enough space so that the dialogue can happen naturally, but we also want to make sure that we're asking questions so that we do help the customer to fulfill their objective. Because after all, it's really hard to get 3 hours of an executive team. So we want to make sure that we use most of their time.
And is it mostly, sort of decision based kind of turns or processes, or are there other components where, let's say you feed them like an MD5 and that MD5 happens to be in VT and they have to like pull that down and do some reverse engineering on the malware and gather further intel to provide feed like the detection process or the hunt process. Are there those sorts of components that get more technical and in the weeds, or is it mostly kind of like turn based? Kind of everyone walks through the decision just kind of verbally.
Yeah, especially for the technical ones, we do try to go, let's say, in the weeds a little bit more. So, for example, we'll say you figured out that there's connections being made to this domain or this IP. Walk us through your process and how you would use your existing threat intelligence or whatever defender's feeding you to find out more information. Walk us through what you would actually look for in Defender and how you would actually do a larger hunt across the organization based on the IOCs that you're finding. How would you actually correlate to figure out, based on your CMDB and the information defender, figure out what assets were impacted and their business critical value or not? So it definitely depends. What I think we get the biggest value out is really to look at process first, and that's at the executive and technical level. But as you, let's say, formalize and mature some of those processes, then we can look at the more granular aspects of it. How are your actual investigation processes happening? And that can happen at the discussion level, or we can even do certain elements of hands and keyboard to say, we're actually going to feed you this. This is actually in your environment. Can you go look for that? Can you actually respond to that? Can you actually show us your investigation process on Defender or on CrowdStrike? And that, once you walk through some of those processes to actually get some of those hands-on keyboard elements, and you can then exercise elements of your playbooks, and then we can actually see more tangibly what is your team comfortable with, what do they have defined processes with, or what are they good at talking through, but then practically maybe there's some gaps there that they don't actually know, and we can help flag those and identify those as part of recommendations for the exercise so that those can be improved as well.
What are some of the components for successful tabletop exercises that you've seen? So you've done many of these with customers. You've seen examples, I'm sure, where customers are able to really get a lot out of it. What are sort of the typical ingredients and criteria for successfully run tabletop exercise?
That's a good question. I think the one thing that you'll hear the team say the most is this is not an audit. And often we get a lot of different reactions to that. But honestly, it's not an audit. And I would say, honestly, the biggest factor is being candid and being open. I would never go into a tabletop and say to someone, I want you to be very good at this tabletop. If anything, we want you to be honest and transparent with us and talk through some of the gaps you don't know so we can have conversations about that. You've got everybody in the room. This is a great time to talk about things you don't know so that collectively, while everyone's there for those 3 to 4 hours, we can try to figure out, okay, great. How important is that? What do you know? What don't you know? And how could we figure this out? So get some live real time problem solving. Without that, where everyone's trying to keep information and keep it a little bit tighter and not reveal some of the cracks, it's harder to have a good discussion about it because nobody wants to share. And I would say the other thing is the more you tell us about your environment, the more we're able to tailor the exercise, make it real, make it relevant, and also bring in other people potentially. Because then you say, well, we're going to focus on this specific application, or we're going to focus on this part of the environment. Well, let's bring in some stakeholders from those environments who would actually be involved. So the more specific and the more tailored we can make it, the more relevant it is, the more engagement we can really drive.
You may have touched on this already as sort of the inverse of this, but I'm also curious, what are some of the things that you've typically seen to be challenges or roadblocks or hindrances to a good tabletop experience for the customer?
As mentioned, the doing well is tough, right? I know there's often an element where tabletop exercises are often, and we're often, and probably still very much are viewed as a compliance thing. You got to do tabletop exercises. We really want to do well. And there's obviously an element to making sure that we're not designing an exercise that makes everybody lost or confused or get too frustrated, right? So we want to drive a positive conversation. But if there's always that concern around, let's just really keep it tight and not share and try to make sure it sounds like we're doing everything perfectly, that doesn't allow us to have the specific conversations around what's going well, what isn't going well, what do we know, what do we not know, and how do we drive those improvements. The other one is obviously lack of engagement, and that could be during the exercise itself. And that's our job as facilitators to try to tease that out and encourage people to engage and participate. But also during the design phase, if we don't get enough information to design something that's customized to your environment, then from our perspective, it's a lot harder to make a very relevant exercise. And we find that that can show up in the delivery because we don't want people to say, well, that doesn't really make sense, or that's not really topical, or that's not a concern for us, right? Because the more of those detractors you have, the more likely it is for people not to be engaged. And we want to make sure that this is as relevant and customized to an organization's environment so they feel like this could happen. Let's take it seriously and let's walk through all the different steps. That's important for us in order to get that engagement is to really make it as custom. And if we don't get that information, it's hard to do.
Yeah, it seems like there's an element of you get what you put into it with that level of engagement and going in wanting to participate. I could also imagine, there's probably in places you've probably seen this pop up, but there's the office politics part of this, right? Where maybe one organization was really advocating, hey, we should do a tabletop exercise, guys. And then, maybe there's other parts of the organization that they don't feel as prepared or they're worried about that kind of shining a light on parts of the process component that maybe they don't want as focused on. So I can imagine that's also something where you're going into these organizations and there's these structures that can be maybe challenging to navigate sometimes from a political standpoint.
Absolutely. That's one thing that we've actually highlighted is are you bringing the right people to the table and how do we engage some of these extra teams that historically were not viewed as part of security, right? And as more that the industry matures, the more we're realizing that OT, development, business leaders, we need to bring them to these conversations so they can be part of it. They're going to play a role during an actual incident. They're going to have opinions on response and recovery. They're also going to be important for communication with stakeholders. And historically, I feel like maybe all these different groups were not always brought in at the right times or not engaged in this conversation, or we threw security at them and said, hey, you guys got to take care of this, but they weren't engaged as part of the conversation. And that's important for us in order to make sure that we're having those wholesome conversations and to get that engagement.
So we finished the tabletop exercise. Now it seems like there's also one of the kind of key pieces in all this, which is, there's the after action, there's the sort of lessons learned or lessons identified, however you want to frame that. But then there's the sort of question of like, okay, what do we do with this, right? How do we cement the output of this engagement, the effort we spent kind of, alongside with the customer, kind of crafting the right scenario and event, bringing everyone together, taking time out of their day jobs to do this. You obviously don't want to say, oh, look, we identified these, 4 or 5 key things, and then everyone just kind of goes, on with their day. So what are kind of the steps that you take to help ensure and help that organization cement what came out of the actual event?
First one I would say is we always try to make sure that we have time to do a debrief at the end. So people are able to share their thoughts and they're able to hear what other people thought. And that's very much a less of a focus on us as Mandiant speaking, but more on the customer to say, we want you to hear from the different teams so that you get a chance to contribute, right? Because the more people contribute, the more they feel like they're involved, but also to hear from others. And that's for some dialogues behind the scenes. So we start that conversation by having the debrief, and then usually a week or two later we say, hey, here are these recommendations. Do you want us to facilitate a broader debrief among your team so that we can actually assign responsible teams, and also they have a chance to ask us questions, right? So instead of having them say, oh, well, we just got this recommendation from Mandiant and now we got to go deal with it, they can ask us questions, we can provide some additional guidance, we can help walk them through it, so that it's not just here's a recommendation, goodbye, you're on your own, right? We want to be a partner and help you alongside with it. The other thing that we've also found that's quite useful is you know what your major gaps are, you know what your debrief, major points were. Let's do another one in 6 months and let's design it specifically to test that. You weren't good at granular roles and responsibilities, perhaps, or maybe your external communications, you're still not sure exactly what that process looks like for approval, or maybe we just talked about ransomware and some of the key things around paying a ransom demand, but those hadn't really been fleshed out. So let's do another one specifically designed, maybe even shorter. And let's test some of those so that you get that reinforcement to say, hey, we didn't know this, and now we've developed this. Did the thing we developed really fill in that gap? And it honestly, it doesn't have to be with Mandiant. We're happy to do it again, but we've also helped organizations design their own to a certain degree and say we're going to run this internally because it doesn't need to be so full fledged. But we want to make sure that we are doing something to reinforce that activity, and we can help through that to say here's some of the key things. Here we can help you design one, and you can go run it yourself.
I guess I could have asked this at the beginning too, around sort of the design piece of it. But do you find that there's often certain times in an organization's, um, maturity or growth or change that organizations reach out looking to have a tabletop exercise? Is it at the beginning of the year? Is it at the end of the year when they're like, oh, we've got some budget for this sort of thing, or we're going about to go out in front of the board and we want something really kind of tangible to point to, maybe to help like advocate for increased funding for security? Are there certain things like that that you typically find are the catalyst for being brought in to do these sorts of things?
Yeah, end of year is always a good one. We call it tabletop season sometimes affectionately because there's a lot of people doing it, whether it's for compliance, because it's year end, because they've been meaning to do it all year. So that's pretty common, and that's a good thing. We see a lot of people, and it allows us to take all the findings from the year, see what we've seen in IR, see what we're seeing with threat actors, and pull it all in, right? So it's very fresh. There's other times too where we find that, for example, there's a new CISO, they want to do one, or for example, there's a change in CIO leadership and they want to see how their security teams are forming, or they want to figure out how security will interact with the executive team in case of an incident. So then we'll jump in and say, absolutely, we can help you with that. Let's design something that's not too complicated, but allows you to see the inner workings of how your crisis management or executive leadership team works. And then other times we've had specific asks to say, we've been growing our footprint in cloud. And now we've got cloud incident response team here. We've got our regular security operations center. We've got the incident response team who's responsible for a different domain. How do these teams all work together? And we're seeing that a lot more, right, as organizations are expanding their footprint into different environments, also as organizations are acquiring different companies. And so that's where that's also useful to say, now that we've got all these moving parts, we can on paper design something, but let's do an exercise first so that we can walk through that and figure out how do the teams think they're going to interact. Do we have an issue with that, or do we think there's a better model that could improve escalation, notification, even just general information sharing so that everyone isn't working in silos? And that's a great time in a moment of change to run an exercise so that you're then aware of the different gaps, but you're also able to identify here's where we're missing and here's where we could use some more guidance, here's where we could enhance our processes, and then get that on paper based on what you've actually observed.
So wrapping this all up, and we talked a little bit at kind of the outset of this or beforehand before we started recording. It seems like one of the things that's changing how organizations think about doing this is the nature of the threats that we see today, the rise of multifaceted extortion, and especially some of the privacy and regulatory issues that kind of come along with that, the impact of brands as we see data leaked out as a common occurrence in some of these extortion operations. That's something where organizations have had to think through not just the impact to continuity of operations with ransomware shutting down their systems, but also like how is their brand impacted, and that seems to have changed the maybe the extent of board involvement, of C-suite involvement, but certainly involving their comms, general counsel. So, kind of tying this all together, where do you see how kind of the approach organizations take to tabletop exercises changing going forward? Do you think we're going to see more investment from some of those business owners in this process? And I guess just sort of any thoughts around, how organizations should be thinking, when they're like, hey, maybe it's been a while since I've done one of these, and sort of approaching that, doing tabletop exercises going forward.
Definitely the involvement of business stakeholders is a big one. Reaching out to, let's say, key application teams at the executive level, and then on the technical side, the development teams. We've had a huge uptick in asks around involving supply chain compromise as a key scenario and bringing in the development team and the different representatives to say, if this was to happen, if we were made aware of a vulnerability that was actively being exploited, how would we figure this out? And so the topic of secure development and development teams within an incident, that's quite popular right now, as we've seen more and more of that as well in the incident side as well. From a board perspective, that's interesting that you bring that up, because that's something that we've had also an increase of requests for, to say, do we know how we're engaging our board? Does our board know what we are supposed to do? Like, have those expectations been made clear between the board and the executive team? And also, are we aware internally exactly what the board wants? Does the board know exactly what they want, or should we tease that out, right? So we've been doing a lot more of those simulated incidents and discussions to say, how is the board notified? How is the board engaged? What, if anything, does the board want approval for? And if so, what does that look like? How would you feed them information? Who's going to feed them information? That's also been a very big one, as we've seen more high profile incidents over the last number of years, and to understand what's that authority and what's that purview the board needs. And crisis communications is also a good one as well. We've, again, seen a larger focus on that. We've seen a lot of interesting interactions, right? As privacy breaches come out, as data leaks come out, and to understand how does the crisis communication team get involved. And so we've had some exercises that are more focused specifically on communications to really figure out not just do you have a holding statement, but how would you actually share this? How would that actually get approved? And if you're someone like a multinational company or a global company, how would you actually distribute this out to all the different regions? But also, how would you collect all the feedback that's coming back to that team who's developing it, so they're aware of all the different stakeholders and all the different opinions? And so, we were talking earlier about how is that tangibly happening. There's a lot of operational elements to say, well, that's great and all, we have an overall plan, but we actually haven't figured out how we're going to share information with the Asia region. For example, if we're operating out of Eastern Canada, how are we getting some of that real-time feedback, or how are we taking care of some of that lag, so that we can make sure that we're accounting for some of the feedback we're hearing over there.
Well, excellent. This has been a fantastic, I think, deep dive into this world of tabletop exercises. Alicia, thank you for sharing all this insight. We'll include some links in the show notes to some of the resources for people that want to learn more about that offering here at Mandiant. And good luck. Hopefully, you don't get too swamped and busy as we go into tabletop exercise season. But thanks for joining today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.